next is hindsight bias. Okay. So hindsight bias is also called as outcome bias. So what is outcome bias? I'm sure all of you have friends who, after something happens, will tell you, I mean, I told you so. Or this particular creepy determinism, like wherein somebody comes and tell you that I always knew that it's going to happen that way, is called hindsight bias. And in this case, what happens is typically it's not that they always knew that it is going to happen. What happens typically in this case is it's again a cognitive illusion, wherein your mind is readjusting the thought process and forgetting what you were believing in the previous case. Okay. So after the occurrence of the event, a substitution happens, and many of us can't even believe that we thought differently before the event. So this is what happens in the case of hindsight bias. Typically, the process involved is the first step is memory distortion. After the event happens, your memory kind of automatically gets distorted, wherein you replace some of your previous assumptions with new set of assumptions. And this happens without your knowledge. Second thing is then suddenly it looks very inevitable. You think that it had to happen that way only. And then suddenly it all looks very foreseeable. So this is a process that happens in hindsight bias. And this typically happens because system one presents the world to us as tidy, predictable, and coherent than actually it is. And the illusion that one understands the past leads to the belief that we can predict the future. Okay, so this is the reason why hindsight bias occurs. And the other thing that you have to remember is hindsight bias has serious negative effects. The first thing is the quality of decision or the quality of the decision maker is directly linked to the quality of the outcome. So nobody will look at the process that the quality of the process that went behind a particular decision. So if a decision turns out to result in positive outcomes, then everyone will kind of praise that particular decision maker, stating that he is a visionary and he thought right, and like basically suddenly everything will look and sound positive for that particular individual. Whereas if something goes wrong, nobody will be willing to look at whether the right process was followed or whether there was a set process at all and all that. So what happens in this case is, one is certain people tend to become very risk averse because there is so much of. Hello?
Guys, please mute your microphones.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So, no, I thought somebody was asking something. So anyway, it's okay. So what I was saying is the um, the the decision maker is evaluated based on the outcome and not based on whether he actually did the right thing. Okay. So that makes people either very risk averse or very rash in their decision making. So anyway, everything is going to be, so they will say that, yeah, I have a gut feel or I have intuitive feeling and hence I've done this. So which can easily lead to wrong consequences. The other thing is hindsight bias also can make you feel guilty or silly, because when a lot of people tell you that, yeah, I mean, you couldn't even guess that, you will also think that, yeah, it was so predictable and you still couldn't do the right thing. And the next thing is people also would tend to apportion blame based on hindsight bias, telling that somebody couldn't even predict something which was so foreseeable. Okay, so what we have to do in such cases is that we have to stick to a process. It is always better, at least in the case of important decisions, to write down our assumptions and then keep it for our reference later to really see whether how our mind is shifting when the event has passed by. So that's one thing. And also, in case there is any blame game and all that, you can of course show what had happened before that. So another thing that I wanted to also state here is that a lot of self-help or wisdom or management books are tailor-made to satisfy this particular need. So what they typically do is they exaggerate the success and also exaggerate the failures. So so then they will make it, because they are all working on things which have already happened, and it will all be perfectly clear. It will all fall into a particular pattern. So they will then exaggerate the success, exaggerate the failure, and then associate the reasons why it was so predictable, and why, what is it that you have to do to be successful or to avoid failures. So this is typically how the self-help books are kind of tuned. And this is not to kind of discourage you guys from reading self-help books, but when even I have kind of read a lot of them, and a few of them are useful as well. They have some tips and all that, but don't get carried away too much with that. You should have a critical mind and a critical thinking when you take any such advice from anyone, be it a guru or be it any such self-help kind of books. Okay. So the other thing I also wanted to state is that hindsight is a useful phenomenon. So because hindsight helps us prepare to not repeat the mistakes that we have.
Manoj, I think audio has cut off suddenly.
It's
Yeah,
not audible.
Yeah, it's back. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So that's what I kind of wanted to kind of leave thoughts on this hindsight bias. The so here again is a few examples. So this gentleman is having a dinner with his partner, and he's saying that the Bali bombing was very predictable. So his partner is asking him, "Where do you think the next one might happen?" So he's very upset, and he says that the next one won't be so predictable. Okay. So here, this gentleman says that the Facebook share price hitting a rock bottom was very predictable. And again, he's saying the same thing when the price goes up. So typically, if you guys watch business news channels, you'll find analysis like this, like why a share went up or down. So they will talk both ways. On one hand, this happened. On the other hand, the other happened, and all that. So everything kind of is made to look or fit into a pattern and made to look predictable. Whereas there is so much of randomness around us that prediction is very difficult. Especially long-term prediction is extremely difficult. Short-term predictions, probably based on certain study and all that, it might be okay, but long-term prediction is definitely not easy. So, like what I said, I have kind of touched upon, say, three or four maybe important biases. Now, I'll quickly run through a few more by putting up certain examples only. Okay. So the next one is called availability heuristics. So this is basically making your decisions based on the news that is available latest or most common. Like for example, in the current situation, even if somebody has a cold and fever or a little bit of throat pain, all of us will associate that to corona, right? So, or the other commonly stated example for this is terrorist attacks. So all of us are so paranoid and scared of a terrorist attack. However, if you really statistically look at it, the number of people who get killed or impacted by terrorist attacks is very low. Okay. Yeah. So the next one is attribution bias. So attribution bias is so basically when we do or think something, we associate or we attribute a certain reason, but then when somebody else is doing the same thing, we kind of attribute a different reason or we attribute certain motives. That's what is called attribution bias. Okay. So as you can see in this particular example, the biker gang shootout is seen as an isolated event. Wall Street fraud is seen as a isolated event, police brutality, whereas looting is seen as an issue of a particular community. Immediately we are kind of attributing that particular behavior to a community, saying that that community always behaves in that particular way. Okay, or maybe this example is from the US, but more back in our case, like I might say that I'm a vegetarian because I'm conscious about health. But when it comes to somebody else, I might say that he's a vegetarian because of religious reason, for example. Right? So that is called attribution bias. The next one is framing effect. So framing effect is basically uh, influencing your decision based on how the options are placed. So for example, how likely are you to buy a food item which contains 10% fat? Or if I were to put it in a different way, if I say that this food item is 90% fat free, which one are you more likely to pick? You generally would pick the one which I say it is 90% fat free, right? So that is what is framing effect. So like what you can see in this particular example. So there is this particular poor lady here. She's actually telling the harsh truth, wherein she's saying that there has been only 4.6% reduction in carbon emission in the last 5 years. Okay, which is actually a pretty bad scene. But this gentleman here, probably a politician, he's saying that thanks to our aggressive stance on climate change, the government has reduced carbon emission by almost 5%. Basically, they are saying the same thing, but then people think that there is some major, good thing happening here compared to what the reality is. So this is what is framing effect. Next is anchoring effect. So anchoring effect is typically what the salespeople do. So if they want, say, 1,000 rupees for something, they'll start at 5,000 rupees, so that you are kind of more attached towards 5,000 and not towards, say, 100 or 200. Okay, so that's what is anchoring effect. So again, I've put in a Dilbert example. Um, the next one is what is called a sunk cost bias. So sunk cost bias is what we call as throwing good money after bad. So what it means is, like, if you have invested some effort or energy on doing certain tasks, and you have already realized that you're not going to be successful, or it's not going to come out the way you had intended that to come out, you would still not stop attempting to do that because you have already invested so much of effort and time in it. So what happens there is you end up wasting more effort and money on it. So that's what is called sunk cost bias. To give you an example, like you go for a movie and after say 30 minutes or 45 minutes, you realize that it is a pretty bad movie and it's extremely boring. But still you will continue to see the whole movie. You'll sit for another 2 more hours, waste the time, then come out of the theater because you have already invested probably 100 rupees on buying the ticket and another, say, 40-45 minutes seeing that movie. So this is what is called sunk cost bias. So one more Dilbert example. So because of, I'm just going quick. The next one is what we call as a Dunning-Kruger effect. So Dunning-Kruger effect, the name is sounding very fashionable, but then it only means that basically it is what we call as unskilled and unaware. So generally, we have a tendency to overestimate our capability or our knowledge. Okay. And this also can be a serious learning disability. Not recognizing what we don't know is a serious learning disability. And that is what is called Dunning-Kruger. So as an example, I put one cartoon strip from Calvin and Hobbes. But I think this is something that you can very easily relate to. You have Einstein and Trump and their viewpoints, which um, very well reflect the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay.